Good afternoon. Welcome all here. Very impressive to see such a big audience interested in the practical tips and tricks of doing a process mining analysis. Anna asked me to give some more practical information on actually preparing your data. Since not everyone's in the luxury position of the previous speaker here, of just extracting the data out of an older or legacy system and immediately has a nice input to start process mining. The topic of this talk is about how to go from more a relational database towards a log that we can start a process mining analysis on. So we have all been, or at least I think you've probably all been in a situation like, oh yes, we have a lot of data. We can start doing a process mining analysis. Certainly if you introduce the topic for the first time, you say we extract data out of an information system that supports a process. And we're going to uncover the real underlying process. And they say, oh yeah, we have a lot of data and we record a lot of timestamps, so can we start? So yes, we can start, probably. Let's have a look at it. First we have to check some things, set your goal, and then this presentation is about a step-by-step approach of how to go from such a relational database. So if your data is scattered over different tables instead of having like one nice table which has a process instance and the steps with the timestamp. So before you start your approach, the first thing that you need to do at the start of a process mining analysis anyway is to set, okay, what's our main goal? Are we going to look at this process from an efficiency point of view, like the previous talk, for example? Or are we going to look at this process more from a compliance point of view? And then I'm thinking mainly about internal or external auditors. I'm not saying that one goal excludes the other, but normally there's like one main goal and the other one's like nice to have an extra add-on, but not our main focus. It's not the ultimate responsibility of that project sponsor. So the first step is to identify what I call the process cornerstones. I stay away from the word activity because otherwise it's too mixed up. So my first suggestion is start your talk with sitting together with both a process owner and both an IT person who knows the information system that supports your process under investigation. Preferably put, even if it's only 2 people, put those 2 people together in one room and discuss really like a novice, okay, what's your process about? Which key steps do you have in your process? And immediately ask at the IT person, okay, do you recognize this? Do you see also these steps in your head in your information system? Is there some information stored in a table on what the process person, if I put it like that, is talking about? So you sit together, you identify your key cornerstones, so the key activities, to put it like that, of your process. And you're going to identify the tables that capture timestamps of that activity. So that's the main question to identify your cornerstones is if someone's saying this happens and then that happens and then that happens, the main thing you always have to question, do we have a timestamp? Do we have a registration anywhere of a timestamp that that activity takes place? If yes, okay, we can see that as a cornerstone. Most of the time, if we're talking about a business process, you will see that the activities are mainly related to an activity on a document. So that's a little bit different from an operational process with, for example, a procure-to-pay process. Almost all activities that are mentioned, like there's an approval of a purchase order or something like that, most of those activities are really a transaction that are document related. Last in this step is that you immediately in the beginning of your process already force yourself to list 3 to 5 key tests that you have in your head. Like, this is what we're going, these are the questions that we want to solve, or that we want to get some insights or get some answers on. This helps you also forcing to see your goal very clearly and to make it explicit, because sometimes you can have 2 people in the room and saying, yeah, we're going for efficiency goal. And then if you ask them to pronounce or make some tests explicit, you will see that they have a very different approach or view or expectations of the process analysis. So it's very important to set that clear in the beginning, also because in a later phase, this will come forward to take some decisions. So I have in my presentation, each time I present first the step that you need to take generally, and then I'll go, as you see here, in a current example to show you more in depth what I mean with this step. So for example, we're going to take a look at a process of a procure to pay, so a traditional purchasing process, and we're going to look at it from a goal of compliance. So more an internal auditor that wants to have a look at the procurement process. We sit together with both a process owner or someone responsible or very familiar from an operational point of view with that process, and an IT person or someone who's affiliated with the information system at that company that supports the purchasing process. Well, after talking with those persons, we've identified the following activities. So first creating a purchase requisition, then a purchase order, approving that purchase order, receiving goods, and booking the invoice. That's what came out of the talk with the 2 persons. And also along the ways, you've noticed that they mentioned, yes, but if we change something, then something else happens. So you can keep that and add that to your list, like, okay, that's actually also a cornerstone. So step away from what's from the standard process and what might be a deviation from it or a variation. Just keep it added to your list of a cornerstone. The key tests that were identified, it's a fictitious example, by the way, are, for example, to check segregation of duty between the activities PO creation and the receipt of goods, and a segregation of duty between 2 levels of approvals of the PO, for example. And if there is an invoice, is there always a preceding purchase order? Those 3 might be the 3 main tests that this internal auditor has in its mind, like, okay, at the end of this process mining analysis, these are the tests that I at least want to have a clear answer on. Step 2, we're going from those cornerstones to documents. So as I said before, traditionally or specifically in business processes, you might see that the cornerstones are all related to documents. So in the second step, we are first going to identify those underlying documents. And then in the second step, we're going to identify the tables that are underlying these transactions on these documents. So let me go again to the example to make this clear. So in the first sub-step, let me call it like that, we're going to go from the cornerstone to the underlying documents. So these were the cornerstones that were identified in step 1. And we're going to ask for each cornerstone, now which document is affected by this cornerstone or key step. I've listed them at the second column. Most of them are very straightforward, but for example, receive goods. you have to discuss with the people and ask, okay, goods received, where is this stored in your database, and on which document do we see something that captures the fact that the goods that were ordered are actually also received. And they will say, okay, we check or we add that information to the purchase order. So that can be different in another company. So you make the link from the cornerstone to the document. And then in the next sub-step, you're going to check, like, okay, this is the process flow that we see. This is actually the document flow, so it's another dimension. This is the document flow. Now we're going to check if we combine those cornerstones and the documents that are affected, if we combine this information, in which table can we find a timestamp that tells us when did this activity took place? So there is a list here that tells us, so this is really information from the IT person or the person that's very familiar with the information system that supports that, that process, that tells us, okay, these and these and these are the tables that we ultimately are going to have a look at. So this is the output of step 2. We're going to work further on that in the next step. Step 3. For step 3, we're going to take the list of the tables that we just identified in step 2, and we're going to build an entity relationship diagram on this. I don't have any idea about the background of you all, so I'll just quickly explain the entity relationship diagram. So it's a visual representation to tell the underlying relationship between multiple tables. So for example, if I draw these two rectangles, purchase order line and invoice line, the two rectangles represent two tables. One table with information on purchase order lines, and one table with information on invoice lines. And I draw a line between them, saying that I can go from a record in one table to a record in the other table via a primary key, for example, or a secondary key. And these marks tell me what the relation is between those two tables. For example, if I want to go from a purchase order line to an invoice line, I can have this symbol, means that one purchase order line can result into several invoice lines. The other way around, I only took the maximum. You can also take the minimum, but I left that out. This one is like only one. So if I start with an invoice line and I would go to the table with purchase order lines, I would maximum find one purchase order line relating to that invoice line. So it's a graphical way of telling the relationship between different tables. So if we now go to, oh yeah, sorry, forgot this one. If you've drawn this entity relationship diagram, at the end result, you're going to have a look at that and check for yourself, are there parent-child relationships between them, and are there many-to-many relationships? It's a bit more technical, but it's important that you have a look at it and that you realize all the underlying relationships between those tables. Because, and that's actually very important, building an event log, there's not like one correct way to do it. You can take multiple choices at different steps, and I can't say like this one is the best or this one is better than the other one. I can just give you some guidelines, like these are best practices that I've experienced, and these are the consequences. And that's very important because nowadays sometimes I bump into people and I say, what is your event log built like? What are your underlying assumptions? What did you choose as a process instance? Oh, it's a purchase order. It's a purchase order, or is it a purchase order line? Or is it an invoice? I don't know, it's a purchase. And that's very important because that choice, again, there is no wrong, or good or bad choice, but it's important that you at least are aware of your choices because it affects the interpretation of the analysis results. So that's the most important of the whole presentation. Okay, so if you've drawn your entity relationship diagram, have a look. Are there parent-child relationships? It will become clear in my examples for the ones who are not familiar with the terminology. And are there many-to-many relationships? So back to my running example. So we start, let me go back. We start now with the output of step 2. We take that as the input for step 3. And we're going to actually list those 6, I think, tables and draw the relationships between those 6 tables to have a look how can we jump from one table and the timestamp in that table, because that's what it's all about. How can we go from one table and jump to the other table? So these are the first 2 tables. There's a one-to-one relationship, means if we have a table with a purchase order header, so all the header information of purchase orders, and we have another table with all the header information of purchase requisitions, there's a one-to-one relationship. One purchase requisition maximum leads to one purchase order, and one purchase order at max leads to one purchase requisition, or is preceded by one purchase requisition. The third table was the log header, so a table that captures header information of all changes that have been stored in that information system. There's a one-to-many relationship if we go from the purchase order to the changes. In other words, there can be multiple changes on one purchase order. And vice versa, if we have a look at a change record in the change log table, one change can only belong to maximum one purchase order header. Okay. The next table in our list, the output list of table step 2, was purchase order history. At the moment, we cannot link that table to one of the tables that's already in our diagram. So at that moment, you start discussing and asking, gaining extra information. Where's the link between what I already have and my new table in the list? And in this example, it appears that we have to go from the purchase order header via the purchase order line to the purchase order history. Okay, so we add that extra information. So we know that if we want to go from information that's stored in a purchase order header, and we want to go to purchase order history, which we put in our list because there was a relevant timestamp for us, even if you don't recall anymore which one, you follow just those lists, like we need those tables and those timestamps. The next one is invoice header, and again, we cannot connect it immediately with the previous tables. Again, we need some additional table, invoice lines. So we see that we can go from a purchase order to an invoice if we only have a look at header information, so take the whole purchase order and the whole invoice. We can only link one another if we go to the lines on that purchase order and the lines of an invoice and then link back. And the last table was line information of the logs, so of the changes that we can nicely relate to the log header information. Okay, so this is the complete entity relationship diagram of the tables that appear to be relevant to us, building further on what we've identified in step 2. Now, as I said before, now we have to look and get a little bit familiar with the underlying relationships. Are there parent-child relationships? Yes, we can see that very easily. Here, purchase order header and line. So we have one header and multiple lines that are possible, and we have that same construction with the invoices and with the change log header and log line. That's parent-child relationship. The many-to-many relationship is what we see from purchase order header to invoice header. Since we have here one-to-many and a bit later many-to-one relationship, we can see that one purchase order can lead to several invoices. On the other hand, one invoice can also refer back to several purchase orders. And it's very important, again, to understand those underlying relations when you choose your process instance. This is the fourth step, to select our process instance. So the process instance is the ultimate object of what you will follow throughout your process. So that's the thing that is very easily sometimes said, like the concept, yeah, we're going to follow purchases. Yeah, but once you need to pin that down, like, okay, what's a purchase? Is that a purchase order? Or is it an accounts payable? Or what is it? So that's where this step belongs. Now, since my example, and I think it's more difficult in business processes, document-based processes, than in operational processes, I will continue on this one. We're going to have a look at one of those documents as the possible candidates for being such a process instance. And actually there are two dimensions that we have to consider and that we have to take a decision on. Are we going to take a document that is at the start, the middle, or the end of our process? Or that's one dimension. And the other dimension is, are we going to take, if we've chosen which document, and there are maybe like a header and a line level, there are multiple levels, which level are we going to take? So actually we have two separate questions that we need to take a decision. And again, there's no wrong or good decision. It's just like some tips and tricks that you know the consequences of your decision. So put visually, you can have 3 documents in time. So which document are you going to take? And maybe, for example, document 1 only has a header level, so there's only one option, but maybe document 2 and 3 also have an item level. The ultimate question is, which of the 5 combinations are we going to select as a process instance? So, some guidelines to take your decision. Start, middle versus end document. You first have to check whether there is one single point of entry in your process or whether it's possible to also enter your process in the middle or at the end document. If there's only one single entry point, like mostly in operational processes, if you don't start in the beginning, yeah, you can't just start an operational process in the middle. So if there's only one point of entry, it's very simple, then you just take your start document. That's a straightforward choice, of course. If there are multiple points of entry, you have to check, what was my goal again? And if your goal was efficiency, then I suggest you take your start document. If your goal was compliance, my suggestion is to take the end document. I will show you graphically with an example why. Take, for example, that this is reality. You have, I don't know how many, I guess like 15 or 16 process executions, and some of them only have to start in the middle document and lack the third document. Some of them only have the third document, some start at the middle document. Okay, that's reality. Then you're going to pick your process instance, select Make your choice. And depending on that choice, you're going to lose some of those process executions. And that's what people not always are aware about. So take a start document as a process instance, then we will have an event log that loses all the pale colored process executions. So we will lose 5 process executions. The result is, if we select a start document as our process instance, that we will be able to capture fallout. The ones that start and that did not get to the end, they fall out. It's maybe a form of waste also, in terminology of Lean Six Sigma. The fallout will be identified if we choose for our start document. That's why I say if you choose for efficiency as a goal, you may be interested to take the start document as your process instance. On the other hand, non-compliance, process executions that just start in the middle or at the end, won't be captured in your event log. They exist in reality, but they won't be part of your event log. And if it's not in your event log, you will, of course, not identify it in your analysis in the next phase. If we take the end document as a process instance, we will lose 3 process executions, or 4, sorry, in this example. The good thing is that non-compliance will show. So that's why I say if your main goal is compliance, you might be interested to take the end document as your process instance, but fallout won't be identified anymore. So it's a trade-off. And additionally, but this is also with the start document, I just didn't show it also on the other slide, you also have these exceptions which have like one document in the middle. It didn't start in the beginning and it maybe fell out, but it could also be just a process which has not finished yet. Okay, since I showed this by an example, I will not go to that through our running example completely again. Then the header on line level. So the first dimension was which document, the first, the middle, the end, or many more. It's the same terminology principle. The other dimension that we had to take a standpoint on was, are we going to take a header level or a line level? If we have those parent-child relationships. So that's why it's important when you draw your entity relationship diagram that you stand still at that question, because if you don't have those parent-child relationships, like header and line level, you can of course skip this dimension. So here is where your key tests in step 1 come into play. You retake those key tests that you have made explicit, and you're going to check those activities that are involved in your key tests. Are they taking place on a header or on a line level? And a general rule is just to take the highest level of the activities that are involved. So in case of the mixed levels, take the highest level. We go through the example later on to make it a bit more clear, but this is the general rule that I suggest. Take the highest level, but of course the activities that are on a line level, you have to take a decision, what are we going to do? Since we're going to work on a higher level, and we have also activities on this lower level, we have to decide on an aggregation level. Are we going to aggregate them and only take the first of those activities at the lower level? Are we going to take the middle, the last? Do we keep them all, for example? Let's go to the example to make it a bit more concrete. So this was our running example. We have 3 documents: purchase requisition, purchase order, invoice. And we have the same situation as the one that I showed before. The first document only had a header level, and the other 2 documents had both a header and an item level. So you really have to see that header and item level as if this was your paper document, all the information that's on your header, like who's the supplier, What's the delivery? No, not the delivery date. That's on item level. Delivery address, for example. The header information, that's in the table with all that header. And the item, like bring me 1,000 blocks of paper and 1,000 pencils. Those are 2 items. So the paper and pencils, etc., is information that's in the table with item or line information. So in our example, to take the decision whether to take a start, a middle, or end process, we have multiple points of entry. It is possible to have an invoice without a purchase order, or to have a purchase order without a purchase requisition. So the idea was, if you have multiple points of entry, check what your goal is. Our goal was, in our example, compliance. And in case of compliance, we suggest to take the end document, so the invoice in this example. So we know already going to take the invoice level, but are we going to take header, or are we going to take the line level? So that's for our next dimension. So for this dimension, we were going to check the key tests that we already formulated. These are the key tests repeated. The activities involved in these tests are only those 4. And I've put in a column beside that on which level those activities are situated. We take the highest level, so, the invoice header level is chosen as a process instance. Now, as I said before, if you also have activities on a lower level, like for example, here we have receive goods, is captured in the table with PO line information, like our 100 or 1,000 blocks of paper received or not. That's captured in the table with purchase order line information. We have to decide our aggregation level if we're going for that choice of invoice header as a process instance. So this choice of taking an invoice at a header level as a process instance means every purchase that resulted in an invoice will be in scope of our process mining analysis. We're going to go back in time and trace back on the underlying purchase order and purchase requisitions. Also see the related goods received, but we will have multiple goods received because that's stored on purchase order line level. And we're following one large invoice with, as we know from our entity relationship diagram, with multiple purchase order lines. Are we going to keep track of all those goods received, or only the first one, or only the last one, or what are we going to take? So you have to take a decision on that. So this is, in our running example, the ultimate choice. The 5th step is identify the activities in our event log. So we've already identified cornerstones, and on purpose I did not use the word activities because otherwise it would be a little chaos here. But now the idea is to go from those cornerstones to the final activities in our event log, the activities that we can relate to the chosen process instance. So when we're talking about the cornerstones in our initial meeting with someone who's very affected with the process from an operational point of view and information systems point of view, we're not talking or thinking at that moment already about can we link those to all those activities. What's a process instance? We didn't think about that. We just thought like, okay, what are the key steps? In meanwhile, we've chosen a process instance, and now we're going to identify the activities that will be part of our event log. And now we have, of course, to check whether we can link those cornerstones to the selected process instance. So the start of this step is the set of timestamps that we selected in step 2, so those cornerstones with the tables and the timestamps in those tables, but with a small checkup like, okay, can we still link all those identified cornerstones to the selected process instance? In the next step, we're going to add all other timestamps from those tables. Because we've, in that second step, just said, okay, there's a cornerstone. Where do we find a timestamp related to that cornerstone? Oh, it was in that table. But maybe in that table there are like other timestamps. And now we're going to add all those timestamps as possible candidates for interesting activities. In the third step, we're going to prune. So we're going to delete what's not interesting. So you first add everything, and then you're going to check, okay, what's relevant and what's not relevant. For these questions, you always take your goal in the back of your mind. Always think in the mindset of, okay, my key goal of my analysis was gaining more insight in efficiency or in compliance. I'd like to answer this or this type of questions. Which timestamp is relevant in order to pursue that goal or not? And then the fourth step is sometimes we say, do we have a timestamp on that? And they say, yeah, we have a timestamp, and the IT person, I'm not going to say IT guy, can be a woman too. The IT person says, yeah, we have a timestamp on that. If you have a look at field blah, 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 if it has a value n, then that timestamp tells you when the goods are received, for example. Now in this step, you're going to check again and say, okay, but you said we have to check that a certain value is n. If that certain value is not n, what are those timestamps then capturing? And maybe those are also interesting activities. So that's your fourth step. So that's what I call attribute-dependent timestamp. Your timestamp to capture a certain activity, received goods in our case, is dependent on a value in an attribute, an extra field. Okay? So put it graphically, I'm a graphical person. If I see it graphically, it got stuck. So maybe some of you too. So for those two maybe in the room. So we start with a certain set of activities. Those were the cornerstones that were identified in the second step. We add some more, namely all the timestamps in those identified tables. We add all of them, and in the third step we might say, okay, the third one is not relevant to our goal. We delete them. And in the fourth step, you might see, actually, to get to this timestamp, I have to look at a value at another field, and actually I can split that timestamp in two different activities and replace that activity on a higher level. I'll get to the example to make it more explicit. And then we remove this one actually, and we add those two at the back. Okay, our running example to make it clear. So we start with the cornerstones identified in step 2. I relisted them here, and they're all possible to link with the chosen process instance, because we've seen that entity relationship diagram. We can all link everything to that invoice header. In the second step, we add all possible timestamps, other timestamps that we find. Traditionally, in ERP systems, there are a lot of timestamps on the table of invoices, like when was it received, when was it entered in the system, when was it booked, when was it... You have 5 different timestamps, I think, in the general ledger of SAP, for example. So, for example, I've just invented this, okay? This is just a fictitious example. So let's say that I have an extra timestamp on purchase order last changed, when the invoice was entered in the system, when the payment was received, and change PO line. So this is the moment that you might bump into extra activities. Oh yeah, we didn't think about the payment step. We've thought about there's an invoice that we have to book. Yes, of course, we're also interested in when do we receive actually our payment. But you might also say, okay, when the PO was last changed, and a change of a PO line is not of interest for us, and we just discard those activities. And the fourth step was to have a look at those attribute-dependent timestamps. So actually receive goods in our example was such an activity. We have a timestamp in a certain table that captures the receipt of goods if a certain value is X. Now, then you start asking what are the other possible values, and then you might learn, oh, if that same value holds a value double X, it's actually received of your invoice. You say, oh, that might be interesting too, and I'm going to add that activity. So that's how you build your set of activities. You start from what you just learned in a starting interview, which are your cornerstones, and then later on you grow and you shrink that size actually again from possible activities purely built on the timestamps in the related tables, the identified tables. And then we're at the last step actually. Attribute versus extra dimension. So we've identified our process instance, we've identified our activities, and of course you also have a lot of attributes, all these extra characteristics in your event log. And in this last step, you're going to check whether those attributes might be interesting to bring an extra dimension in your event log and maybe create an extra activity out of these attributes. Those are, again, these type of choices that you just make. No good or wrong way of making that choice. Just important that you're aware of the consequences or the possibilities. So it's important to differentiate between case attributes and event attributes. So case attributes tell something about the case as a whole. If there are n possible values, you might be interested in creating not six activities, but n times 6 activities. I'll go to example in the next slide. An activity attribute with n values, you might want to split one certain activity that activity attribute tells something on. You might want to split that again in n activities. Let me show it again visually with an example. So imagine you have a case attribute telling you something about the type of a case. You have n types, and the values are, because it's a case attribute, are mutually exclusive. You are either a type A or a type B. You cannot hold both. So one process instance will only show one value of that attribute, mutually exclusive. Then you have two options. Or you keep that as an attribute and you use it later on as a filter. In this call, you analyze your event log and then you say, now show me type A, show me type B. If you have only two values, of course. Or you might choose to, if you have only two values, to duplicate, or if you have n values, to create n-fold activities. For all different cases, a separate subflow, actually. So if I choose to keep it as an attribute, I created a quick example with, here are two underlying types of cases. I have one view, one process, and I see, oh, there's a self loop here, a large one, 6 times self loop, and here's one self loop on this activity. Now I can start using my filters and get some more information. I could have chosen for the duplication, so the twofold activities, and use the information of what type of case it is and add it to the activity itself. The result is that I literally take all my activities times n. So if you have 3 or 4 values for your case attribute, you will really, and you already start with 15 activities, and you have 3 values of your case attribute, beware that you will end up with 3 times 15, you have 45 boxes in your process model. So beware of the explosion dimension, but if you have low numbers, the result is that you see very visually which type of case dominates your process. There's clearly one type which is more dominant than the other one. And you see nicely that the self loop on this activity relates to this type of case, and the self loop on this activity relates to that type of case. So this is type information that you now see immediately on one screenshot. So again, it's just a choice that you have to take in combination with how many boxes do I already have on my process model, and how many different values do I have in this case attribute. So this is one. And then we also have the activity attribute. This one is going to give some extra information on one specific activity within the process. So not on the whole process like the case attribute. Now we might be interested in duplicating or expanding that single activity by n, being again n the number of values that are possible within that case activity attribute. So, for example, we have a certain activity scan document, and we might have an activity attribute about the document. Is it a purchase order? Is it a purchase requisition or an invoice? And the question is, do we keep scan document as an activity and store the type of document as an attribute, and we use it again later on to filter on? Or are we going to create 3 different activities on this lower level? Visually, this is the scan document with the different attributes or information on the document stored as an attribute, and we don't have a visual on what's going on now anymore. If I take exactly that same input and I attach the information of the document, which was in this model an activity attribute, then I have, since there were 3 different values possible for the activity attributes, I make this one activity result in 3 different activities. Scan, I have to get closer. Scan PR, scan purchase order, and scan invoice, I think, here. Yeah. So by inserting that information of the activity attribute in the activity, we get a better visual on when this activity takes place in the process, instead of having all these loopbacks and don't get a clear overview of what's taking place anymore. So again, you have to question, of course, this is because I have 3 times that activity, and each time with a different value for that activity attribute. If you say, no, normally I only have 1 time in the process a scan document, and sometimes it's 1 document and sometimes it's another document, but typically in one process execution there's only 1 time that activity scan document, and I don't care whether that document is a purchase requisition or an invoice, you can leave that out. But at least be aware of the decision that you made, I hope explicitly in your mind, and not that you just go over the decision without even noticing that you've taken a decision. That's the main point. So in our running example, the activity receive goods and receive invoice are such an example of 2-fold activities that stem from actually 1 timestamp with 2 values for 1 activity attribute. So the overview of the approach is, first, set your goal. because it inspires you to take all your decisions in the other steps. Identify your process cornerstones during your meeting with maybe process owner, but doesn't need to be someone who's very acquainted with the process, the operational part, and someone who's very acquainted with the information systems part. Then identify what the related documents are and what tables hold the timestamps of the activities on those documents. Draw the entity relationship diagram of those tables that you've just listed in step 2. Select your process instance according to those 2 dimensions. Am I going to take a document from the beginning of the process, or am I going to take a document at the end of the process? Am I going to take a header level or an item level? Identify your activities according to the graphical flow. You start, you expand, you shrink again. Okay, and then evaluate, and this can be a possible overlap with the 4th part in this phase. Evaluate the attributes that you have as possible candidates to give an extra dimension on your activities. And then if you've done all these steps, you have an event log to mine in case you're not in the luxury position of the previous speaker who just says like, here's my event log and we can start mining. Thank you for your attention.